Hello, everybody. I'm Nate Brantingham.
And I'm Frank Newport.
And we want to welcome you to the Objective Religion Podcast. This is our podcast in partnership with the Institute for Studies of Religion at Baylor University, which is designed to put you, the listener, at the intersection of religion and data-driven social science, helping us to understand religion and its effect on individuals and society today. So Frank, I'm looking at some of the headlines, and the overlap between religion and society is just kind of jumping off the page and the screen at me. So I'm going to give you an example. So for example, there's a quote going around by the religious right activist Ralph Reed, who says, "There has never been anyone who has defended us and who has fought for us, who we have loved more than Donald J. Trump. No one." And then on the left, we have presidential candidate Pete Buttigieg, who says, "But we need to not be afraid to invoke arguments that we are convincing on why Christian faith is going to point you in a progressive direction." And then a headline on 538 website that says the Christian right is helping drive liberals away from religion. And then Franklin Graham, of course, saying, "I wish President Trump's enemies would just give it a rest." So what's going on here? I thought we were kind of seeing like the tail end of Christendom, and yet religion is still all around us, society, politically. It's in our dialogue.
Oh, absolutely. As those headlines point out, you were just reading, Nate, there, religion is very much alive and with us and very much an integral part of our culture and our society. You may remember Time magazine back in the 1960s had this headline, "God is Dead."
I do remember that, yeah.
And as we're going to be covering in this podcast, there are a lot of indications of change in the religious landscape in America today. That's what kind of makes it so exciting, I think, for us to be looking at all of this. But what you just told us shows that religion is an integral part of the political sphere of America today. In fact, I think it's fair to say that the relationship between individuals with a high degree of religiosity, particularly white Protestants, often called evangelicals, and we're going to come back to this, the relationship between those white evangelicals in support for President Trump and for the Republican Party is an integral part of A, why President Trump got elected to begin with, and B, why he is sustaining a 40 to 45% overall job approval rating. So even though we have seen massive changes in some indications of religiosity and religion in American society today, it's very much with us and very much a very important part of our culture and of our society.
Okay, but there's a recent headline in The Atlantic that says, 3 decades ago, America lost its religion. Why? Has it lost its religion? Because you're arguing here, it sounds like that it has not lost its religion.
Yes, absolutely. One of the things that I'm asked about more than anything else, Nate, is the rise of the nuns. How's that? Sounds like a science fiction movie title, but we're talking about nuns here, N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S. People often say, "What do you mean the rise of the nuns? Catholic sisters?" And so, no, it's N-O-N-E-S. And nuns, to those of us who study religion, are those individuals who, when we ask the classic religious identity question, do you consider yourself Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Muslim, Mormon,
right,
or some other religion, or no religion at all? That's the group who say no religion at all. They don't have a religious identity. Those are the nuns. And that's what you're talking about in the headline that you read a moment ago. We have seen a significant and substantial rise in the number of individuals in this country who, when asked that religious identity question, will say none. Why that's the case, what that indicates, that's some of the things we're going to talk about in this podcast, because I think it's one of the more fascinating elements of religiosity and religion and culture and society that we see in America today.
So Frank, we are also lucky to have this partnership with the Baylor Institute for Studies of Religion, and they haven't been quiet either about these topics. Here's 2 headlines from them. The first one says, "Belief, Behavior, and Belonging, How Faith is Indispensable in Preventing and Recovering from Substance Abuse." And this headline, "Religious People Are Happier, Study Finds." So why are we seeing some reports on the one hand saying that religion is dying out, to be overly dramatic, and on the other hand, that religion is actually a good thing for us?
Well, those are 2 different sides of, or 2 different aspects, I should say, of what we study when we look at religion objectively in society today. This finding that religion is related to, I'm not saying causes, but I'm saying religion is related to higher levels of well-being and happiness and maybe even physical health is one of the more robust findings that we find in social science, not even just in the study of religion, but in social science in general. Nate, I saw an article the other day that had reviewed 139 separate studies looking at this relationship between religiosity and well-being, and the conclusion of those authors were, looking at all of these studies, both in the U.S. and globally, that this is one of the more robust conclusions that we have. As I mentioned, there is a strong, reliable relationship between being religious and having higher levels of well-being. It's complicated. We find, for example, in a lot of the research that active participation in a religious community, church attendance, being part of a church, is probably the most related to well-being. And the thing that seems to be affected the most is psychological well-being or happiness rather than physical health, which is a little more controversial. But the relationship is there. So in fact, I might tell you, I was talking to a professor of economics, actually a famous professor of economics a while back, and he was studying these same data internationally. I think this is interesting, Nate. And he himself was an agnostic, self-admitted agnostic, not a religious individual. But he says, the more I study these data worldwide about the relationship between well-being and religion, the more I think I should become religious myself. Now, I'm not sure if he went that far. He was an older gentleman. I'm not sure he actually changed his own religiosity. But the point is, the data were so compelling for him that he said it almost leads me to the point where I think I should become more religious because the positive outcomes seem to be so remarkable in the data that we can look at both in the U.S. and around the world.
And yet the nuns, the NONES, are making the opposite decision to become less and less religious than their parents or the previous generation, right? So there's some tension there between these two studies. One is saying what's good for us, but that doesn't mean necessarily that's the thing we're going to choose to do, right? That's two different decisions there.
That's right. And that may be because the word is not out. A lot of people who are not religious or the nuns may not be aware of the salubrious consequences of being religious. It's a complicated area, but you're absolutely right. At the same time, as we're going to talk about, that we see a decline in a number of measures of religiosity, and we'll talk about what that means. We see more and more evidence that being religious is actually good for people, at least in terms of these kind of outcome variables like well-being and happiness.
Okay, well, we'll come back to those topics and a lot more as our segments continue.
Nate, here's an interesting question for you, but don't answer it right now because we want our listeners to think about this and see if they can come up with the answer, and we're going to give you the answer at the end of our podcast. What state of the union has the highest percentage of Catholics in the United States and the lowest? Not the highest absolute number of Catholics, but as a percentage of population, the highest percent and the lowest. Now, don't answer it, but what are your general thoughts here, Nate?
Yeah, well, I can't answer it because I don't have the answer, but I'm thinking on it. I'm thinking there's probably been a shift, and I think that two of the social shifts that might be in here is previous in the United States history is a lot of Catholic immigration on the East Coast, and then now we have a lot of immigration coming up from the South, which comes with a Catholic attachment in many ways. So I'm going to guess that it probably used to be the East and is now somewhere in the South.
Well, interesting answer, Nate. I will say, to give you a general broad view of what we're going to be able to tell you at the end of the podcast, that the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast, that's the East, are high in terms of percentage of Catholics. We also have some states in the Midwest that have a pretty high Catholic percentage, and because of the immigration of Hispanics who tend to be Catholic, not universally, which is interesting. Not all Hispanics identify with the Catholic faith, but the majority do. Because of the influx of Hispanic population in some southwestern states, we also have a higher percent of Catholics in some of those as well. So between those three groupings, one of those has the highest percentage of Catholics in the U.S.
So, Frank, we've been talking a little bit now, and you've been sharing all these insights about religion and society. So where are you getting this information? Where are you getting all this stuff? Can you share a little bit about your background?
Well, Nate, I've spent a good part of my professional career studying and analyzing this cross-current between religion and society. I have a PhD in sociology from the University of Michigan, and that's where I first taught a class in the sociology of religion. I taught the sociology of religion when I was a professor at the University of Missouri St. Louis, and over the last number of decades, I've been editor-in-chief at Gallup. now senior scientist at Gallup, and during that whole time period, I've been able to use survey research as the mechanism for studying religion in society today, following the tradition of Dr. George Gallup, who really started asking questions about religion in his surveys back in the 40s and 50s, and that was continued by his son, George Gallup Jr. Interesting point, Nate. The government can't ask about religion. Did you know that?
I did not. Why not?
No question to the census. It's against the law, separation of church and state. So one of the reasons that survey research, like we do at Gallup and other esteemed institutions do as well, is so important is because it provides us the only objective database of knowledge about religion that we have. Unlike so much else that social scientists look at, we can't rely on the government to provide us that kind of information. What about you, Nate? What brings you to this juncture where we're talking about so avidly religion in society?
I am interested in religion. My background, though, is actually in entrepreneurship. I started in business and entrepreneurship. I did that for quite a while. And then I started getting really excited about the way that these sort of models that we're learning about in business can be applied to religion and within churches and contexts. So I got really excited about churches doing new ministries, new missions, new outreaches, that sort of thing. And that kind of led me to come to Princeton Theological Seminary and study religion a little bit more. I just graduated with my MDiv from the seminary. And as I was kind of looking at what I was going to do next and where I was going to head, and we did study a little bit about religion and society, I ran into you and we started having some conversations. And I got really excited about talking with you more and maybe recording these conversations and seeing where they go.
And hence our podcast, Objective Religion.
And hence the podcast.
Yeah, and I might mention, in terms of my own background, in addition to my social scientific interests, which come through sociology, which is what I have my doctorate in and what I've worked in for many, many years, my father was a Southern Baptist theologian. He was a professor at what was at the time the largest seminary in the world, Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Fort Worth, for many years, and he also taught at Rice University. So I came up understanding, I think, pretty well the nuances of that particular aspect of religion, the more evangelical Protestant tradition in this country. My mother's side of the family was very involved in Southern Baptist religion as well. So a lot of that background in religion gave me, I think, an understanding and an interest and a curiosity about religion, which has led on to where we are today. As an undergraduate, I went to Baylor University, the aforementioned Baylor University, and that's one of the reasons that I'm very, very happy that we are partnering with Baylor University, because that is an institute that is set up to do almost exactly what we're talking about here, and that is to try to understand and analyze religion. And my good friend, Dr. Byron Johnson, is the director of the Institute, ISR, and our producers recently had a chance to sit down with Byron and get his input and thoughts about what he does there and how all that fits into this podcast.
My name is Byron Johnson. I came to Baylor in 2004 to establish the Institute for Studies of Religion. The idea was to create a research center dedicated to the study of religion in public life. And I'm surrounded by a bunch of scholars from different disciplines. The one thing that we all have in common is that we're interested in the study of religion. So from epidemiology to sociology to political science to criminology and history and philosophy and everything in between, we all do serious studies of religion in both contemporary society and historically speaking. Well, ISR is really pleased to be able to announce a partnership with Frank Newport and others in the launching of Objective Religion, a podcast that talks about religion in a way that's not tied to any specific religious belief or doctrine. It is just simply, how do we look at religion and get it right? There's a lot of misleading information out there. And I think people hear about religion, and when they see or read about something that doesn't make sense to them, it makes them wonder if what they're hearing is legitimate. That's what this podcast is about. We're going to be interviewing people from different, political backgrounds and experiences to see if we can capture what's really going on with religion in America. Is it in decline or is it thriving? And what does religious life look like up close and personal at the individual level, and what does it look like for organizations and groups. One of the reasons it's important to study religion today is that oftentimes what we know or hear about religion is inaccurate. Sometimes it's slightly misleading, and sometimes it's quite shockingly wrong. We think that that is unfortunate, and one of the things that we're dedicated to doing is treating religion as it should be treated, and subject to scrutiny and rigor. And so that's what we do. We do studies on religion that help us understand what's really happening. How does religion really affect people's lives? How does faith, prayer, and religious practices affect people? These are things that we think should be done and done well. We not only want to know how often people pray, we want to know why people pray, what they pray about, to whom do they pray, and to what effect. These are things that we think are important, but they're often neglected. You look at the textbooks that line the bookcases of so many offices of historians or politicians or political scientists, I should say, or sociologists, and you won't see textbooks that cover religion. It's typically left out. And we think that this is an oversight that has shortchanged students. We want to make sure that when they study these topics, these great important academic subjects, that religion is covered because we think it's relevant for all of these different academic disciplines.
All right, Frank. So since I've got you here, can I just shoot at you a whole bunch of different questions and stereotypes and things that I just want to confirm because you've got access to this data?
All right, go ahead.
All right. So since you're a resident expert, here's some of the things I've just been dying to know. The first one is, out of the news, I'm hearing a lot that all evangelicals support Trump. Is that true?
Well, the key there, I think, is the word all. You know, we talked about earlier in the podcast that clearly there is a relationship between being religious and identifying as a Republican, and that in turn means that you support Donald Trump. But that question is fraught with nuance. How's that? Who are evangelicals, and how do we define supporting Trump? I think we're going to come back and talk about how we define evangelicals. A very fascinating concept in our American culture because we hear that word used so often. But when you said all evangelicals support Trump, I would have to say no. Now, of course, nothing's 100% in life, but the best research that we have now suggests that maybe 65 to 70% of how evangelicals are conventionally defined would say that they support Trump in the sense that they say they approve of the job he's doing. Now, that's a high number given that his overall job approval rating in these same surveys is about 40 to 45%, but clearly not universal. That's why the all word doesn't work. That leaves about 30% of Americans who are evangelical. White, Protestant, highly religious Americans is what we're calling evangelicals. About 30% say they don't support Trump. So it's a clear tendency in the data, in fact, a very strong tendency, but by no means universal.
And do we know regionally if there's other things that tie into it? Like, would evangelicals in one region be more likely to support Trump than evangelicals in another region? Or do we know where that 30% that doesn't support comes from? Is there some unifying factor there?
Well, I wouldn't say a unifying factor, but there are clearly geographic factors in support for Trump, which would overlay what we're talking about here in terms of evangelical support. Support for Trump is very high in the South. That's where we have the highest percent of Republicans for the most part, except for some states like Wyoming and so forth. But the southern states are where we have the highest percent support for Trump, the highest percent Republicans in the country. So evangelicals who are living down there would be more likely to support Trump than people who we could classify as evangelicals but live, let's say, in Maryland or Vermont or Massachusetts or some of the other states which clearly are much less likely to be red states, that is, to support the Republican Party and to support Donald Trump.
So, Frank, we've been talking about this word evangelical a lot, but how are we even defining that? What is evangelical as far as the data says?
Nate, you've been studying theology at seminary. What would you say? When you hear the word evangelical, what comes to mind first?
I think there's a lot of conflating between the term evangelical and fundamental. And I think a lot of times those two get seen as identical. And I think actually for a lot of people who would identify, they would also probably say I identify as both. But what does the data say those are the same or are they different? Now, a fundamentalist, there are clear pillars to what makes you a fundamentalist. Is there the same sort of pillars of support for evangelical?
There's not, because it's a definitional question. And that's a very good point, the distinction between fundamentalist and evangelical, and there's no clear-cut answer. As you say, being a fundamentalist has a little more clear-cut definition and belief in an inerrant Bible. The Bible's literally true, being one of the key cornerstones of being a fundamentalist. But being an evangelical is curiously defined in many different ways. One of the ways that we at Gallup have done this, and people elsewhere like at Pew Research have done it, is simply to ask people, are you an evangelical or not? Sometimes we say, are you evangelical or born again? And actually, when we say, are you evangelical or born again, we get about 40% of the American public who'll say yes. If we say, are you just evangelical, it's down in the 30% range who'll say yes to that question. But there are other research entities who take the fundamentalist criteria and say that has to be part of a definition of evangelical. Barna Research is an interesting group which asks a bunch of questions of people, and you have to believe there is a Satan, there's a literal hell, there's a literal heaven. You have to believe in an inerrant Bible. You have to say, I believe in God. You have to be an evangelical in the sense that you actively try to go out and convert people and so on and so forth. You have to say yes to all those questions to be an evangelical in their formatting, and that gets it down into only the single digits who will say yes. There's another method, which is hard, but sometimes Pew Research, to their credit, has asked people, what is your religious identity, and then what is your specific denomination? And they go into great detail to find out about the kind of church that somebody goes to. Then they take that, Protestants, and go through and try to classify those churches as to whether they're evangelical churches or not. So if you say, I go to a Pentecostal church, I'm a Southern Baptist, or you go to some other churches like the Nazarene or a lot of non-denominational churches, they will put you in as an evangelical using that criteria of your religious identity, and then you're down into the lower 20% range. You say yes to that. The definition that I like more than any other is to look at religiosity based on church attendance. Do you attend church extremely regularly, weekly or almost every week? Are you a Protestant? Put those two together. And then for most of our analytic purposes, we take whites only. We back out African Americans for some interesting political reasons, and we're left with this group of people who are highly religious white Protestants. That's my functional equivalent of evangelicals as we look at it at Gallup. And that's about 14-15% of the overall U.S. adult population.
But that's a pretty wide net that's going to pick up a lot of mainline Protestant denominations who might not immediately want to self-identify as evangelical. Is that?
That's right. That's right. You would have some individuals who are Presbyterians or Episcopalians who attend church regularly who would qualify as evangelicals in that criteria. But it's a simple way to do it, and I think generally speaking for analytic purposes it works pretty well. But as I say, there are other ways of doing it, and you can overlay it with questions about faith and beliefs and the denomination with which you identify or the church you attend to make it much more complicated. All this by way of saying, Nate, that it's complex. This whole area is extremely complex. When we hear this term bandied about, evangelical, you have to keep in mind that people have different measurement criteria for who is or who isn't in that broad group.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well, I'm going to hit you with another one then. Next one, since this one's a little bit closer to home, I'm from the Northwest, which has a very high percentage of Mormon populations. And my understanding is that roughly, well, I'm going to say the word all again, but I know it's going to get me in trouble, but all residents in Utah are Mormon? Most residents in Utah are Mormon?
That would be false. Utah does have the highest percent of Mormons of any state in the Union. That's a no-brainer, right? Because that's how the state was founded, that area was founded by Brigham Young and his followers many, many years ago. But our latest data shows that only about 55% of adult residents of Utah are Mormons. Again, the highest percentage in the country because only about 2% of all Americans are Mormon, or LDS, Latter-day Saints. But that's high, but certainly not universal. And interestingly, that 40% plus of residents of Utah who are not Mormon are actually less religious than Americans as a whole. So you've got two groups of people in Utah. You've got the Mormons, and you've got people who are actually less religious that are the non-Mormons in that state. Other states that have a high Mormon percentage, as you might imagine, and as you alluded to a moment ago talking about the Northwest, are states contiguous to Utah. Idaho has the second highest percentage at about 18%, and Arizona and Wyoming and some of those other states have at least above average percent of Mormons in them. But Utah is by no means totally Mormon, although it certainly has majority Mormon population.
Fascinating to me that if they're not Mormon, they're less religious. Where is that coming from?
Well, some of those may be lapsed Mormons, and sometimes when you're a lapsed Mormon, you are probably less religious because you've kind of given up on the whole.
That's what I was wondering. Yeah.
Unlike a lot of churches, the LDS Church is pretty rigorous about allowing you to still be a Mormon if you no longer adhere to a lot of their tenets of faith and behaviors and so forth. So that's probably one of the reasons why you've got some less religious people running around in Utah when we ask these kind of survey questions.
So they just might be better at cleaning the rolls than, say, Presbyterians who might have people on their books for 50 years who haven't darkened the door of a church in those same 50 years.
I think that's accurate. LDS is pretty good about saying if you're going to be a Mormon, call yourself a Mormon, participate in our Mormon activities, you need to pretty rigorously adhere to our standards.
We talked just now about people who are not religious, and we've talked about nuns, but what about those who are not religious who are just avowed atheists, the people who just say there is absolutely no God? Is that number going up as well as the rise of the nuns? Is it going up quickly? What do we know about that?
It's going up some, but let me ask you that question, Nate. What percent of Americans would you say are atheists?
I'm going to pause and I'm going to think. The percent that they say they're atheists, I would say it's probably in the 10 to 20% range.
Not too bad. But again, and how many times am I going to come back to this? It depends on how you ask the question, right? I think with some rigorous questioning, you're down to single digits. Who are atheists. That is, with probing, say, I don't even believe there's anything there's no spiritual entity or being out there. We had a time historically back in the 50s when Gallup would ask, do you believe in God or not? A very binary question. And we would have in the upper 90% who would say yes. Clearly today that's down. In 2017, we asked that question, and we had 87% who in a binary response said, I believe in God.
So 87 yes, and then 13 no.
But when you probe the 13%, you find that they have some conception of a spiritual entity, and so that's why the number shrinks.
So that 13 might include agnostics as well as avowed atheists, but once we strip out the agnostics, then we're down in the single digits?
I think that's correct. Now, some questions will give people an out right off the bat. They'll say, do you believe there's absolutely a God? Do you think there's a God, but you're not sure? Are you absolutely sure that there's not a God? And in that instance, you'll have a lower percent who will say they're absolutely sure that there is a God. So it's a complex way of measuring the question about belief in God. But I think the true classic atheist, absolutely there is no God. I feel safe. It is fair to say that's probably in the single digits, 10% or less.
All right, so one more for this episode, but the number of Americans who identify as Catholics, as I understand it, that is also dropping, as with many other religious people. But for the Catholics in specific, is their drop related to the same things, or is it tied to the priest abuse scandals? Or how is that impacting those who are identifying as Catholics?
Well, you know, the Catholic percentage of the population has not dropped nearly as much as some of the other groups that we look at when we analyze trends over time in religious identification. Catholics have held fairly steady, and there are a number of reasons for that, and I think we'll come back to those a little later. But the priest abuse scandal has not had a dramatic effect, I would say, on the percent of Americans who identify as Catholics, as some might think that it would. The percentage who are Catholics in the country today, which is between 20-24%, is actually not hugely different than what we found back in the 40s and 50s. There was a time when it rose some. We had in some of our surveys in the 70s and 80s maybe up to 28% who are Catholics. Now it's down into 22, 23 in that range, percentage of the adult population who are Catholics. But we have not, contrary to what some people would expect, we have not seen a major or dramatic drop-off in Catholic identification in this country.
Well, thank you, Frank, for answering my questions on that. I've got a lot more questions, but we have more episodes. We'll continue to dig into these things. In the meantime, I know I'm not the only one with questions or thoughts or feelings about these things. So let's go to the street and let's talk to some people on the street and ask them some questions about religion.
So my name is Tala Karani. I'm from Kenya. I'm 18 years old. I was brought up in a Christian family, and coming to America, especially Texas, I was kind of hesitant about all the religious tension that's been going on, especially relating to homosexuality and maybe like conservative and liberal views. Generally, when I think of America, I think of a lot of controversy and division in the church. So I don't think I would be very affected by political candidates' religious views. I'll be more affected by how they put into action what they believed and how they worked for the benefit of other people. So the thing is, like in Kenya, it's like when you say you're Christian, it's kind of seen as like, oh, you're a good person and you give yourself a good person vibe. But if you say you're Christian in America, that kind of has different views and images. And so sometimes people will think that you're too conservative in how you think, and maybe they'll judge you based on that. Other times people will like be more welcoming to you. And so I think that like there's such a wide range of how people will view you when you say you're Christian or when you say you're of a certain religion, because of just like how times are changing.
My name is Kim, and I am 66 years old, and I'm from Plano, Texas. I still think of, when I think of religion in America, I still think that we're a Christian nation because that's how we started. I just think our nation has just fallen farther and farther away from God. I don't know that I know why, but definitely more and more people are just becoming about God.
My name's Kirby. I'm 21 and I'm from Austin, Texas. I consider myself probably spiritual but not religious. I think the dominant religion is no religion, or atheism, if you want to consider that a religion. I feel like the common misconception about religion is that religion has a monopoly on morality, which I feel like is, in my perspective, clearly not true. It's clear that everybody has a sense of morality that transcends religion. There is like an aspect to being in America that comes with religious ideas, like the value of being an individual and the value of having a soul, and those certain Christian ideas are very strong in America, but I think those exist in America more so than the actual religion. I'm not sure what percentage of America would consider themselves Christian, but I feel like if it was measured in 2010, the numbers would look very different in 2019.
Frank, we've just listened to people on the streets sharing their thoughts and ideas and where their opinions are. So if that's the individual picture, what's the big picture? What's America look like from the largest scope out in terms of the data? Who actually identifies with what religion?
Let's think about this, Nate, as a giant pie chart. Think about a giant pie up there, and let's look at where Americans stand. The biggest slice of that pie would be Protestants. Protestants, interesting term. Some of our research shows a lot of younger Americans don't even know what that is now. Isn't that interesting? You'll ask people and say, are you a Protestant? They'll say no, and say, what are you? They'll say, I'm a Methodist. Well, of course, Methodist is Protestant under that broad label, but people don't think of it, particularly young people, as a Protestant. So I think a better label probably is non-Catholic Christian. And that used to be about 75% of Americans, and that has shrunk, and that's now down to a little under 50%. If you put Mormons, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, in there with some other Christian religions, along with the huge myriad of Protestant denominations, we have maybe 45, 48% of Americans. The biggest slice of that pie would still be Protestants.
And that includes the non-denominationals?
That is right. Anybody who says it's a Christian faith would go under this giant non-Catholic Christian slice of the pie. Now, we just said non-Catholic. What about the Catholic slice? We talked about that earlier. Let's say around 22% of Americans would identify as Catholic. So we're up to about 70% of Americans who are Christians. Still a very largely Christian nation today, and that includes mostly Protestants, but also Catholics, as we just talked about. Now, who's left? Well, we have only about 5% of Americans who identify with a non-Christian religion. Isn't that interesting?
So our melting pot only has 5% non-Christian faith?
That's right. At a time when there's a lot of agitation in some quarters not to celebrate Christmas or have Christmas symbols and all that, that comes at a time, and we'll get into that controversy at some other point probably, it comes at a time when we still are largely very much of a Christian nation. About 5% non-Christian religion, about 2% Jewish. Hasn't changed much over time. You go back to the 50s, about 2% of Americans were Jewish, and that includes Muslims, Islam, Hindu, Buddhist, anybody who identifies with the faith that is not Christian. So you add that together, and then you have a few people who don't answer the question. You're up to about 78, 80%. Who's left?
The nuns.
The nuns, that's right. That's about 22% of Americans. So if you look at the slices of the pie, you've got Protestants, and then you have Catholics and nuns, which are competitive in terms of their size, and then a very, very small slice of the pie that's left, and those would be people who are identifying with non-Christian religions.
So when we talk about topics like religion or religiosity, that seems to me like a pretty difficult one to measure. How do you measure how religious somebody is?
Well, that's like measuring how many angels can dance on the head of a
Right,
pin.
exactly.
Right. Well, not that complex. It is more straightforward, but there are many ways of doing it. I think one way to simplify it is simply to say you can measure individual religiosity by asking about attitudes. That is what's going on in your brain, your thoughts about religion. And then the other way to measure it is behavioral. What do you do in terms of actual behavior relating to religion? Probably in the latter category, not probably, but definitely the most used measure of all for religiosity is religious service attendance, church attendance. In fact, there's some research that shows even if there is over-reporting of church attendance, which there is, I think.
I would think so, yeah.
Yeah, I think back to a study some sociologists a number of decades ago took a county in Ohio, Ashtabula County, which is up in the northwest part of Ohio. They did a survey and said, how often do you attend church, so on and so forth. And then they physically went around to every church in that county and tallied up how many people were in the church. They either got a report from the church, and if they couldn't get it, they would count cars in the parking lot. I mean, they did everything possible to physically find out how many warm bodies are in church in Ashtabula County, and they found the discrepancy that would be expected. A higher percent of residents of Ashtabula County said that they attend church every week than they could find evidence of in the churches in the county. So clearly there is a gap there for a number of reasons, but some scholars have said that doesn't matter because self-reported church attendance is a very good measure of religiosity because it gets at how we want to see ourselves.
Right.
And if I want to tell you, the interviewer, that I go to church every week, that tells you something about me, even if you followed me with a video camera and you found that I actually didn't go to church every week. But that's probably the primary measure in that behavioral side that we have been using for decades and decades. And there are a number of ways of measuring that, by the way. Dr. George Gallup started with, did you attend church in the last 7 days? That's an interesting measure. More commonly now, we and others say, how often do you attend church? Every week, almost every week, monthly, and so forth, down to the percent who say never. So that's one measure of religiosity. We can also say, are you a member of a church? Other behavioral measures are, how often do you pray? And do you engage in religiously oriented charitable activities, things along that line. Then over in the cognitive sphere, the most important measure, I think, and I put this in a book I wrote about the evangelical voter a number of years ago, is how important is religion to you in your daily life. That's an incredibly important measure for self-defined importance of religion. So to me, the two primary ways, the best ways to measure religiosity are the two questions that I've just talked about. How important is religion to you in your daily life? Second, how often do you attend religious services? Put those together, and you have, I think, a pretty good way of tabulating religiosity.
So how long have we been tracking religiosity in this country as defined by those two questions?
That's a great question to ask because I think it brings up a very interesting point. Not about 40s and 50s. Gallup really systematically began measuring these questions, responses to these questions in the 50s. So a lot of our data go back no further than the 1950s, and nobody else was measuring it prior to that. Dr. Rodney Stark, who teaches at Baylor University, and he's with the ISR, the Institute for Studies of Religion at Baylor, has done research showing that if you go way back to the revolutionary days in early America, and you actually find very low levels of religiosity. There wasn't that much church attendance at all back on the prairie, and so forth and so on. So he's saying even though we've seen a decline in religious participation in this short window where we've had the measures, if you really go back in time and try to do estimates about church attendance, you can find it was pretty low in America back in the old days. So we have to keep in mind that there's a large, long, I should say, timeline of religious attendance. But our data, in answer to your question, mostly from the last 60 or 70 years.
And what does that data show then? 60, 70 years, that's a small window then comparatively to our history, but what are we seeing in that window?
Oh, I would say a third of Americans attend church regularly. How's that? Looking across all the measures that we have at this point in time, about a third of Americans either say they went in the last 7 days or say they go every week or almost every week. That number was higher We had it up closer to 50% in the high 40% range back in the 1950s, the Eisenhower era, when religiosity was much higher. So that has declined, but that's probably a pretty good measure at this point. We have about half of Americans who will tell us in a survey that religion is extremely important to them in their daily lives, and a significant percent of the other half will say it's somewhat important. So that's another measure. That's declined, mind you. We used to have a significantly higher percent who said religion's extremely important, and that's come down. If you put those two together, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, and create this combination of ingredients measure, extremely important, religion, attend church extremely frequently, or synagogue or mosque, I would say about a third of Americans, in our estimation, 35% can be considered to be highly religious. And maybe a third I would put in the not religious at all category using those two measures.
So looking at the religiosity, and we know that there's a decline as we've been going in the last 50 to 70 years, how much of that decline can we attribute to people falling out of faith, and how much of that decline is just each generation being slightly less religious than the generation before? Extrapolating from what we're saying, I think we can say that the older someone is, probably the more religious they are. Is that accurate?
That's absolutely right. There are two generalizations we can make. Women are more religious than men. We'll do a whole podcast on that sometime. Why? ? Is it genetics? Is it evolution? Why are women more religious than men? That's a universal finding across the world. There are very few countries where men are more religious than women based on our survey indicators. And second, the older you get, the more religious you are up to a certain point. In our data, when you get up to the high 80s or even into the age 90 and more, your religiosity drops because you don't go to church. You're frail and elderly, and so church attendance drops off. But generally speaking, there's some bumps up and down and along the way, but generally speaking, it's a pretty linear relationship between age and being religious.
Okay, well, but speaking from a church perspective, there's a lot of churches that want to know the answer to this one. Does that mean as people age, they're more likely to return to church? Or is it just that people who've been going to church their whole lives are getting older? Which one is it?
That's a generational versus cohort analysis, which is very fascinating in and of itself. In other words, is this a pattern like gray hair? We know that across time, as you get older, you get gray hair, and that's not just because you grew up in the Depression, right? It's that's a thing, and you get frail, and you get stooped, and you're more likely to have heart disease as you get older. Those are generational factors that happen to everybody as they get old. A cohort effect, as I just alluded to, would be something happened to this group of people that grew up in the Depression, and it's just this group of people, and that's why they're doing certain things as they move along. Or the baby boomers, with Vietnam and the hippie generation, certain things imprinted on baby boomers, and that's going to carry them through, but that's not universal for people. The data that I've seen suggests the relationship with age is generational. That is, it's not necessarily just because today's old people grew up differently than what other people will be when they get old in 20 or 30 years. That it's kind of like gray hair, that you get more religious as you age, and that's a generational kind of constant effect. What that means is, and of course, religious leaders listening right now, church leaders listening right now, hope this is the case, that as millennials age, they are going to become more religious and return to church, as has happened to individuals as they move through their 30s and 40s in previous generations. Now, we have to wait and see if there's going to be evidence for that, but at least the data would suggest there's a good chance that that'll happen.
At least to some degree, right? I mean, there's compound effects. It might not come back in droves and in waves to the same degree that other generations have, but at least there will be some aspect of that. There'll be some measure of that coming back is what we're thinking.
That's right. And also it can manifest itself in different ways, right? What do we mean by becoming more religious? Well, classically, when kids left home and went to college or went out into the real world, their religiosity dropped through the basement.
Right.
And then as they aged through their 20s and 30s, they got married and had children, and they would return to church. Very nice picture. That may not happen now. For one thing, millennials are delaying marriage and delaying having children. There's some question about whether the fertility rate will ever catch up for millennials. They may decide they don't want to have children because they're worried about climate change or something like that. But nevertheless, those patterns, even if they do, make the millennial generation, as they age, more likely to be spiritual or religious. They may not go back to church. They may seek religion or a manifestation of their spirituality in other ways. But I think that there is a great potential there, potential energy is within our millennial generation. And as they move through the 30s and 40s, they want spirituality and religion. And it's going to be a question of whether or not today's religious institutions and organizations can reach those people, or there's going to be something totally new that happens.
And is this kind of across all denominational lines or all faith lines? Or are there some? We talked a little bit, but you said that the Catholics are fairly resilient, and others are not. What do we know about that?
Let me give you a couple of examples. One of the reasons that Catholics, you said, are resilient, but one of the reasons that Catholics' percentage of the population has stayed constant is in migration of Hispanics. In other words, as a lot of people, and the data show a lot of people leave the Catholic faith. Young people raised Catholic decide not to be Catholic as they get older, but there's been a replacement over the last number of decades of the in-migration of individuals who have a Catholic faith that they bring with them, primarily people from Mexico, Central and South America. So we have not had a comparable influx of people who are Episcopalian and Presbyterian, right?
Right.
So one of the reasons that we see the shrinking of mainline Protestant denominations is that there's been no in-migration of people to bolster those numbers, and therefore the numbers of Presbyterians and Episcopalians have stayed very constant or actually is shrinking to some degree. So that's one factor with the Catholics. That seems to be what's happening. We have seen a lot of change within the Protestant denomination. As we all know who are listening to this, I think that the biggest growth area has been non-denominational churches.
Right.
We see a general change in American culture and society we sociologists like to look at, where people are kind of abandoning the institutions that used to be quite stable. We're more open to change, not doing the same kind of things we used to do. And so the idea that we would go to a traditional church down the block in the same way that our parents did is becoming less prevalent now. Entrepreneurial ministers, those ministers, people of faith who lead churches who have kind of an entrepreneurial instinct, are not staying within the bounds of the Presbyterian or Episcopalian or Lutheran or Methodist or even Southern Baptist churches. They're striking out on their own and building their own non-denominational churches, and those are where the growth is. So there's been a lot of change within denominations and religions in answer to your question, where some are growing and some are not.
So we're talking a lot about religion and how that's happening through the ages, but we're also talking about society and politics. So what does religiosity tell us about political orientation?
This is such an important topic, Nate, and so relevant today that I think we want to do an entire podcast on it shortly. So people stay tuned for that. But I'll give you the short version of it is the R&R rule. I wrote a book a few years back about religion, and one of my chapters talks about the R&R rule. If you're religious, you're Republican. That's this dominant relationship that we've seen for decades and decades now. It's still prevalent in American society today across groups, across religions, across race groups, and so forth. If you're more religious, you have a higher probability of identifying with the Republican Party. Why is this the case? Question mark. That's the fascinating topic that a lot of people have tried to figure out. There are a lot of reasons for it, a lot of historical and cultural reasons for it. As I mentioned earlier, we saw this relationship, this sorting, as it were, of the population as far back as the Eisenhower years, when he was president in the 1950s, the Nixon years. We really saw the relationship beginning to solidify with Ronald Reagan in the years since. The so-called religious right, the moral majority, all of these kinds of movements which really came into fruition at that point. But the bottom line is, in America today, one of the substantial groups that constitutes the Republican Party are white, highly religious Americans. And one of the groups that constitutes the Democratic Party are people of color, whether they're religious or not, and people who are less religious, the nuns and other people who don't attend church very frequently. So religion provides a very, very dramatic fault line between Republicans and Democrats in this country today. I used to say, if you want to know who somebody is supporting for president, let's go back to 2016. Are you supporting Trump or are you supporting Clinton? You could stop them on the street, and first of all, you would identify their race, because if they were African American, they had an extremely high probability of supporting the Democratic candidate. But if you're just talking about stopping white individuals on the street, one of the questions, or in fact probably the key question you could ask, other than are you a Republican or Democrat, would be how religious are you, how often do you attend church? And if that white respondent on the street said, oh, I go to church every week, then there was a fairly high probability they would be supporting Hillary Clinton. So religion is a dramatic predictor of politics in American society today.
Frank, we're coming near to the end of our time here on this first episode, but before we close out, I need to know the answer to this teaser question. The question was, what state of the union had the highest percentage of Catholics? I had a hunch that originally it was in the Northeast, Mid-Atlantic, and then it had moved to the Southwest because of immigration of Hispanics and Catholic Hispanics kind of moving that focus point. What is the answer? How did I do?
Well, do we have a drum roll? Did you bring your drum? Answer, Rhode Island. Almost 50% of the residents of Rhode Island in the 40% range identify as Roman Catholic, and that is the highest of any state in the Union. The other states that are very high in percent Catholic are right there in the Mid-Atlantic, in the Northeast. And as I mentioned, there are a couple of states like Illinois and Wisconsin that have high percents, and then New Mexico and some states out in that area. But Rhode Island takes the prize as having the highest percent of Catholic of any state in the Union, and the lowest percent Catholic is Mississippi. Mississippi is a hotbed of Southern Baptists and Protestantism, and there are just relatively few Catholics down there. So you're not going to find huge numbers of Catholic churches in Jackson, Mississippi. Go to Providence, Rhode Island, you're going to find many, many Catholic churches, and you're actually going to find people attending them.
So my original hunch was it was somewhere in the Northeast region, and then the changing demographics moved it to the Southwest, but it sounds like there hasn't been enough change yet for that to tip. It's still in the Northeast, where that's the highest.
That's right. A lot of Catholic migration, which came over from Europe. A lot of people who were Catholic came over from Catholic countries, and they settled in the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast. And although we've seen the influx of Hispanics who tend to be Catholic, as we've talked about, and a lot of movement across the country, those pockets of Catholicism in the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast persist to this very day.
Fantastic. All right. Well, I'm looking forward to more teaser questions, getting more questions wrong with you, Frank.
Absolutely. We'll have one next time for you, Nate. I'm sure you'll do better.
I'm sure I won't, but I'm looking forward to it anyway.
You've been listening to the Objective Religion podcast, conducted in partnership with the Institute for the Studies of Religion at Baylor University. We want to thank the director of the Institute for Studies of Religion, Dr. Byron Johnson. We want to thank our producing team, Christian Oliveira, Micah Lambert, and Meg Hofer, and Nate Bradingham. I want to thank you for working with me today. It's been a pleasure, and I really look forward to our next podcast as we continue to explore objective religion.
And do we know what that topic is? What we're going to do next week?
Yes, I think we're going to look at religion and politics in America today with some special guests. One of the most important issues, I think, facing our political and our religious landscape here in 2019.
Looking forward to it. Thank you, Frank.